Welcome to the Nuclear Snail channel. In this video I will talk about the famous question of, is this really post-apocalyptic, or what is and isn't post-apocalyptic? And this question pops up all over the place because post-apocalyptic has many facets and mutations and crossovers with other genres which are sometimes hard to pick apart, and there is no unified definition really, which leads to a lot of discussions, arguments and misunderstandings. So I've decided to make a video about what is and isn't post-apocalyptic, in general, but also specifically regarding your gear. And how post-apocalyptic interacts with other genres, we will also explore that. I will give you a bunch of common characteristics of post-apocalyptic fiction and costumes and whatnot, which you can use to check whether or not something is post-apocalyptic. I will also tell you exactly when to ask and when not to ask this question at all, and what to ask instead, because in a lot of cases, people just are asking the wrong question in the wrong context. I've also gathered some quotes from some of the worldwide post-apocalyptic communities leading people, so their definition of what is and isn't post-apocalyptic, so I have some interesting quotes. If you are one of the influential post-apocalyptic people of the world and I didn't ask you, that is probably just because I wanted to keep the amount of quotes to something sane, so don't be upset about that. So, the reasons why someone might be asking this question can be broken down into three categories, and it's important to understand why someone is asking. So number one is they want to understand artistic genres and how they interlock better, with the focus on post-apocalyptic, and it's a great idea. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen so often in the wild. Number two is academic discussion. People just have fun discussing, just for the sake of discussing, with no practical application. Unfortunately, this leads sometimes to one person just discussing theoretical stuff and other person taking offense because they think that that first person is saying your gear is not post-apocalyptic, and for some reason they believe that there was a unified definition and that it is an insult and all that. So academic discussion usually goes off the rails in this community. And number three is they want to check whether or not their costume and their gear is within specific parameters of a certain event, or they want to argue their way into forcing their style, because post-apocalyptic is a super broad genre. So the usual way it will go down is an organizer will say, our event is post-apocalyptic, here is our style guide, we want this and this and this, we don't want this and that and that. And someone else, one of the participants or potential participants, will either just come with their own definition of post-apocalyptic that doesn't fit the specific style guide, or they will start arguing, but this and that is post-apocalyptic and what you've put in the style guide is not. I would like this to be into blah 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 blah. Look, imagine a cool kid, so organizers in this case, hosting a birthday party and they say, I love pink and I love the 80s. Come in pink 80s clothes. And you will then go like, oh, so it's retro. If we're talking retro, my favorite retro genre is 70s and green. And then you show up with your 70s green costume to a party which was specifically declared to be 80s and pink. Do not be that person. The only thing that matters in those questions is the exact style guide that the organizers provide for their specific event. That is specific. Post-apocalyptic, on the other hand, is a very broad term. So with that out of the way, let's get into what is and isn't post-apocalyptic, neighboring genres, and all those definitions and all that. So the strict definition of post-apocalyptic, and why it's almost useless practically, is it is a world, a universe, in which an apocalyptic event has happened in the past. That's pretty much it. It can be brought about by meteors, zombies, aliens, some spiritual invasions like demons or whatever. Anything you can think of, fantastic or science fiction-y or whatever, that can bring an end to a world as we know it, is post-apocalyptic. Technically. So you see just how much it covers. Also, a lot of famous works and famous universes go from pre-apocalyptic to apocalyptic, so it's happening right now, to post-apocalyptic. I will name a few examples of those as well. But before we go into all that, like I have a list of famous works, famous universes, which I will give genre definitions to, so it's easier for you to see through all of that. Before that, we will talk about neighboring genres. So a broader term, like an umbrella genre under which post-apocalyptic sits, is dystopian. And dystopian is a word that comes from Greek words dys, which means bad, and topos, which means place. So it's a bad place. So a dystopia is just generally some place where things are not so great. Okay? It doesn't even mean that the apocalypse has happened or is happening or is about to happen. A lot of dystopian works don't include the apocalypse, but some do. Everything that is post-apocalyptic is also dystopian, although not really, sorry, because there can technically be a post-apocalypse which is no longer dystopian, but that is like a super rare case. So for a practical application, most things that are post-apocalyptic are also dystopian. But not everything that is dystopian is automatically post-apocalyptic or apocalyptic. Moving on to cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is generally high-tech, low-life. And cyberpunk uses modern or hyper-modern technologies. If you think Elysium or Deus Ex or Shadowrun, so all of those technologies are beyond what we have today. The world is still very grim and dark, so cyberpunk is usually dystopian. Technologies are hyper-modern, or at very least modern. It has to be like at least a couple of steps ahead of what we have today. Then we're moving on to steampunk. Now, steampunk and post-apocalyptic are like oranges and apples, and a lot of people still confuse them. And by that I mean actually it's more like colors and shapes. So post-apocalyptic would be a color and steampunk would be a shape. I will get to the specific relation of post-apocalyptic and steampunk in more detail later in this video. But for now, just steampunk is Victorian era, so steam engine era, aesthetics, with technologies which are, however, beyond what we have today, or at least on par with what we have today. So they will have flying ships and all that, everything in brass, everything fancy looking, like, Victorian era stuff, but with an amazing level of technology. And steampunk is usually rather bright. It is adventurous, but it's not really grim, usually. Dieselpunk is grimmer than steampunk. It's First World War era, so diesel engine era. Everything is grimier, dirtier, grittier, but otherwise it's pretty much the same formula. So we have a retro aesthetic with futuristic technology. Now, retro-futuristic is the term used to describe this kind of stuff. It is retro looks with futuristic technology abilities. Sometimes magic is also in the mix, like magic added with technology or something like that. That is also option. Now let's get to common post-apocalyptic characteristics. A certain amount of them makes something post-apocalyptic enough, if you necessarily need to define it like that. So, post-apocalyptic stuff usually has distressing and weathering, which absolutely makes sense. Now, this is kind of a big point in general, because a lot of times you will have no possibility whatsoever but to have some distressing and weathering on your gear, even if you take great care of it. People who have actual experience will tell you that how fast things deteriorate, especially through everyday use, when you're using it for survival and fighting and all that. There are some exceptions. Obviously, in a post-apocalyptic world, there can be something that is found in a bunker. If you think about the series The 100, you have, and spoilers ahead, you have different factions. You have the Grounders, which have basically tribal-style clothes built from old gear that is distressed and used up a lot. Then you have a space civilization, which are people that went to space and had high technology and have continued to develop, basically, so they have their own look. And then you have basically preserved, classic, founded in a bunker, regular military vest kind of guys in Mount Weather. So yes, even those different aesthetics can coexist in the same world. And also there are differences between the different tribes, how they look depending on where they come from and blah blah blah. But my point is, yes, it is absolutely possible that some things or people are found in a bunker, that some parts of a post-apocalyptic universe have been preserved. Of course, it just doesn't make for such a great story. It makes for a lame excuse most of the times. In The 100, it makes absolute sense, and it is a conclusive part of the story with those mountain people in Mount Weather. But if you're just creating a 300 years after the apocalypse costume and that is found in a bunker, that's obviously boring. All by itself, it could be technically post-apocalyptic, yes, but the better question to all of this is, am I making a good costume that tells a good story without any additional help or explanation? And in the case of lacking distressing in a post-apocalyptic work, it does need a lot of explanation. That is why that will usually not be a good costume. Now, could I say that distressing and weathering is a must in anything post-apocalyptic? No, it's not 100%. However, 90% of the time you need it. Foregoing it is something that I would leave only to special cases and professionals and all that. Like, if you're a noob, distress your gear, don't even discuss with me about that. Common post-apocalyptic characteristic number 2. It usually has reused, scavenged, and or repurposed items, which makes sense. The world has come to an end and now you have a lot of resources lying around that you could repurpose, that you have to repurpose. And this is really at the heart and the core of post-apocalyptic anything, because even if something doesn't look very distressed, it still is likely going to be repurposed after a certain amount of time. The one and the other usually go hand in hand. However, somewhere in the post-apocalyptic story, maybe someone has just created a new spear from spare car parts or whatever, and it has ground it and polished it and all that, and it's not yet distressed. Who knows? Again, it also works, but the best results are achieved if you use distressing and repurposing. With repurposing really being distressing's bigger brother. Because just distressing something is like, okay, you found something in a bunker, then you wore it, it's distressed. But repurposing adds another creative layer. You have to use your brain. You have to be really creative to come up with new purposes for old items. Post-apocalyptic usually has elements that hint at the world before the collapse and the fact that the unbroken world is now in the past. Now, it obviously sounds similar to the repurposing thing, or repurposed thing, or distressed things hint at the world having come to an end, yes. But I've listed this separately because there can be some elements that are not gear that hint at this, or there can be elements that are of no practical use to people anymore that still hint at this. The classic example would be what you see on a lot of movie posters, the Statue of Liberty being buried in the sand and broken and all that, which hints at the collapse of society as we know it, at least in America. But I guess if America goes that far, then the rest of the world goes too. There can be other things like records found in a bunker, or a bunch of dead people everywhere. There are a million ways that hint at the world before it. So there is this contrast before the world before it and the world now. Post-apocalyptic usually involves human struggle for survival and dominance, as well as human drama and at least some suffering. While technically, again, post-apocalyptic can be anything where the apocalypse has happened before the events portrayed, I have rarely seen post-apocalyptic fiction without human struggle for survival and drama and all that, so it's usually grim. The struggle can be against aliens, against zombies, against virus, just general struggle for survival, struggle against other humans, struggle against radioactive beasts, struggle against all of that. So the specifics come in all shapes and forms. Now, post-apocalyptic stuff usually happens in the 20th century or later. Obviously, exceptions and crossovers exist, but the vast majority of post-apocalyptic worlds are set the 20th century or a couple of hundred years later. There are also things like Degenesis, which is set, I think, 1,500 years in the future. There are also post-apocalyptic scenarios and crossovers which might be set in the past, such as a steampunk post-apo crossover, which I will get to. The post-apocalypse usually happens on our planet. It doesn't have to be on our planet, but for the vast majority, it is kind of an indicator. There can be a world where a certain planet, which is not Earth, has experienced an apocalypse, and then the people discover that, oh, our planet has experienced the apocalypse and we actually come from Earth and all that. So there can be a post-apocalyptic element tied into a larger science fiction novel, while the whole story as itself is not post-apocalyptic as a whole, like not all of it. The post-apocalypse usually involves a fair amount of artistic freedom since it's fiction. Now, how free or not free it is up to the artist. It can be really realistically grounded, or it can be really fantastic. If you think of the contrast between The Walking Dead and Borderlands, which I count as post-apocalyptic, I will get to why, as I will go over famous universes. If you think about that contrast, that is quite a contrast. So there can be quite a lot of artistic freedom, and also post-apocalyptic is well suited for tying in other genres, as I've said before. Now, post-apocalyptic can involve varying degrees of social disintegration. So it can be literally from almost all humans are dead and everything is killing everything else as soon as you exit your cave, up to medieval times. There are trade routes and local lords and all that, and so on and so forth. So varying degrees of social disintegration. It can involve all sorts of influences from other styles, as I've said, including reality, including historic reality. You will see a lot of cool works with historical influences mixed in, or fantasy influences mixed in, or steampunk influences mixed in, which I will still get to in more detail soon, or cyberpunk mixed in, or anything else. Post-apocalyptic is a, let's say, chemically very bondy thing. You can bond it with a lot of other things. Post-apocalyptic can have realistic or fantastic styles. So again, Borderlands versus The Walking Dead. Post-apocalyptic can display warriors or civilians or other in-world demographics. So warrior gear at all times is not a must, as long as it overall makes sense. If we again take a post-apocalyptic world where there are cities and local lords and basically medieval-ish kind of society, or some other kind of functioning society where not everyone has to be at full alert and in full gear all the time. On the one hand, in the cities, just like in medieval times, you will have warriors resting in their civil gear, maybe, or you will have a lot of non-warriors and people who never leave the city. They obviously would be carrying around some sort of self-defense tool, because they also did that in medieval times. Really, medieval is a good inspiration for post-apocalyptic. How they did things, how they took care of themselves, how the society was structured, all that. Good inspiration. So a civilian in a post-apocalyptic city, like let's say a trader, would probably carry some sort of a dagger or a pistol or whatever else. They would likely not be running around with a 5-meter long Gauss rifle at all times. Some would, some wouldn't, you know, just like in medieval times. If you would go to a city that is well fortified, inside of that city you might not be able to carry guns by law. Or at least people would be looking at you in a weird way, like, why are you carrying a pike to the market to get some tomatoes or whatever? Well, they didn't have tomatoes for a long time in medieval times, whatever, blah. Your costume doesn't need to be a warrior character to classify as post-apocalyptic. If it fulfills a certain amount of those requirements that I just went over, those common characteristics, then at some fluid gray zone point it does qualify as post-apocalyptic and as generally a good work that fits the genre, although just qualifying as post-apocalyptic doesn't automatically make it a good work. Those are two different things to begin with. But if you're aiming for a post-apocalyptic look and it is kind of within the frame of that is part of you succeeding. But again, it doesn't have to be a full armored warrior guy at all times. It is one of the most common archetypes, obviously, but there are also other costumes and demographic roles in a post-apocalyptic society, which should be obvious, but if it's not, here you go. What happens if you do not incorporate one or two of those common characteristics that I've just named into your work? Well, it depends on what else you're doing. It's very hard to say overall. And it's not like any one of those given characteristics is an absolute must. As I've said, while a lot of them are unavoidable 95% of the time, there can be cases where you do not do weathering and it still looks post-apocalyptic, especially in the right context. But a lot of times it is just a good idea to incorporate a bunch of those into your work, and then it will be within the genre limits. Let's talk about if one characteristic, just one of them, can make your work post-apocalyptic enough. Such as a lot of people will just distress their gear and do nothing else. Like it's just their regular gear, they add some distressing and blah. Not really. I mean, yes, technically, but it's still kind of lame and lazy. Like even if we have a 2 weeks after the zombie apocalypse scenario, just adding some dirt to your gear is a lazy costume design, because even in 2 weeks, even in 1 day, you would do some accommodations. Like you will not go out of your door the same way in a zombie apocalypse, even as your current self with current gear present at home, as you would if in the civilian times. Like I'm not going out armored or with an axe. And even if you don't have an axe at home, you would still grab some sort of makeshift weapon. You would still try to armor yourself with phone books or something, like in that film with Brad Pitt, World War Z, I think. I wonder why not more people do it. Because try biting through a phone book. So that kind of stuff. So you see repurposing and some distressing. Those two usually are really, really important, even if technically not a must. So just one characteristic, I don't know, try to incorporate a bunch of those and then you will be fine. Now, steampunk and post-apocalyptic, or steampunk or other genres, and post-ap. A lot of people confuse those two, which I don't get how is even possible, because steampunk it's kind of like a shape, and post-apocalyptic is kind of like a color, if you get the analogy. So there can be post-apocalyptic steampunk. So we went over both definitions. Steampunk is Victorian era looks with futuristic technology. It's retrofuturistic, and that is pretty much the two most important characteristics of it. Post-apocalyptic is a universe in which the apocalypse has happened, with the common characteristics which I've just named usually being present. So if in a steampunk universe the apocalypse happens, then you have a steampunk apocalyptic look. Really, I have not that often seen a good design of what would actually look like if a steampunk world went post-apoc. It would actually look a lot like Fallout, just instead of the 50s Cold War American aesthetic, there would be the steam engine Victorian era aesthetic. So you would have great factories and machines in that aesthetics which are abandoned and then later repurposed by the civilization that is now post-apocalyptic or is still struggling in the post-apocalyptic world. So yes, it's possible, but it's not the same thing. So post-apocalyptic can also be mixed with cyberpunk or anything else. You see a lot of examples of that too in recent costuming works, because cyberpunk is getting more popular and obviously the post-apocalyptic crowd is not too far removed from that, so you will see even more crossovers soon. Although crossover is a bit harsh word here, because why cannot a cyberpunk world be post-apocalyptic? It's less of a stretch than from steampunk, because steampunk also has secondary characteristic. It has that bright, adventurous, not really grim spirit, while post-apocalyptic is usually grim. Cyberpunk is usually grim as well from the get-go, so it's less of a leap from cyberpunk to post-apocalyptic than it is from steampunk. Same story with dieselpunk. Dieselpunk is usually rather grim, so it's also less of a leap than from steampunk. So in general, post-apocalyptic, it's like a color or a color palette. I don't mean literally. Painting your shit brown doesn't automatically make it post-apocalyptic. That's not what I mean. Tint, color palette, or a flavor that you add to your food. Post-apocalyptic is really like spicy food. Like, what makes spicy food? Well, spice. In this case, those common characteristics, reused stuff, distressing, world has come to an end, blah, 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 blah. So that makes the spice of post-apocalypse. But what can you put it on? Well, almost anything, really. So that is the thing why the genre is so broad and also so accepting of other genres and crossovers and all that if you do it well. Let's move on to the common universes and their definitions, like Mad Max. That's the granddaddy of gasoline-based wasteland, desert, post-apocalypse stuff where people also don't wear a lot except leather straps. Mad Max actually, I believe, popularized the idea of cars in the post-apocalypse and the idea that gasoline would be readily available, which it realistically would not be, but who cares, because it makes for a cool story, so that always trumps realism. Fallout. Retro-futuristic 50s Cold War era American science fiction, going later a bit into science fantasy, which are a bit different. I will not go into that now. But main point is the aesthetic is retro, while the technology provides more whoomp than we have today. So it's retro-futuristic. Obviously the apocalypse has happened, and so it's a very specific flavor that I like. The Walking Dead. Zombie apocalypse going to zombie post-apocalypse in later seasons. So first it's happening right now, and then it's technically post-apocalypse. A lot of people put zombie apocalypse into its own shelf as its own genre, because it is just so very specific, and that's fine, but technically it's still post-apocalyptic. Again, it doesn't matter what kind of beasts or what kind of hazard has brought the apocalypse. Zombies are a legit post-apocalyptic reason. But yeah, zombie apocalypse is a specific taste as well, so that's why people usually put it in a different shelf. Borderlands. Comic style, frontier apocalypse, post-apocalypse thing. I don't even remember whether or not the planet Pandora on which the whole thing happens has experienced an apocalypse as such, or if it's just an abandoned frontier place or something like this, or if it's not really abandoned. The point is, Borderlands has so many of those typical common post-apocalyptic characteristics. You have hazards like raiders and beasts and all that. Okay, the beasts are not mutated, they're just native to the planet, but they will still fuck you up. It has a lot of distressing and weathering and repurposing, that is the main point, and it has a lot of society breakdown. So those are characteristics that qualify it as technically post-apocalyptic for me. Not that I really care about the definition. Again, it doesn't really matter that much. Is it or is it not? To me it is. A lot of people say Stalker is not post-apocalyptic, and I believe that technically maybe not, or maybe yes, I don't even know. Like if we talk about Stalker, in that area in which the whole thing is happening, there is some repurposing going on, or at least people are really trying to take care of their gear, but it's still deteriorating and all that. It's a lot of... It is a really dystopian place too. Now there are some anomalies and stuff, and basically the whole societies are structured in a very survivor-ish, martial kind of way. So it checks a lot of boxes. It's technically not post-apocalyptic because the whole world didn't end, I guess, but again, it doesn't really matter. It has a lot of those common characteristics which make it post-apocalyptic to me. You might disagree. Again, not the most important question is my main point. Waterworld. Well, that's like Mad Max, just with water, so yes, we also have all those checkboxes. Terminator goes from pre-apocalyptic to post-apocalyptic, because at the start, the world didn't end yet. We know it's gonna end, because the robot was sent from the future where it has ended. Time travel stories are usually just basically a faster clock. But Terminator goes from apocalyptic to post-apocalyptic within the story, obviously through a robot apocalypse. Elysium, not post-apocalyptic, technically. However, really dystopian and cyberpunk. So we have those stratified society separation with first-class and second-class citizens. We have a decent amount of sci-fi going on. While it's technically not post-apocalyptic, again, who cares? Like, it's really close to it. You could say that the conditions on the planet's surface are kind of post-apocalyptic because all the rich people left to their space station and stuff, but Again, technically it's not post-apocalyptic. Still a good thing. Shadowrun. Well, that is cyberpunk dystopia. That is actually classic cyberpunk. Not a lot more to say about that. The world hasn't ended really, and everything's running. It's all grim and dark and high-tech, low-life. Classic cyberpunk. Same as Deus Ex. Now let's get on to some warlord quotes from famous people from the post-apocalyptic community. Keep in mind, those are opinions, you can agree or disagree, but those are opinions of smart, respected people, so do with it what you want. In no particular order, even all. Post-apocalyptic is creating art through the recycling of dead technology and use of old world resources. Combining this with custom fabricated items using old world trade skills such as leathercraft, metalworking, sewing and so on, creates an aesthetic that tells a story through the items that the character wears. That is very concise. I think it's good. So this repurposing aspect is really, really strong with Evan's definition. Eric, the Wasteland Pirate. Making outfits with a focus on reused, scavenged or repurposed items and clothing to create a visual impression of a character from after the fall of society. So repurposing and the society has ended. Unifying characteristics is that the pieces are distressed, worn and weathered. But it has to be more than just weathering, or you will look like tactical mud, or you cannot just shred it, or you will look like a punk/hobo. So the point I said before, is just distressing something enough? 95% of cases, no. And Eric emphasizes this point here. Red Roach. For costumes, a clear and definable emphasis on repurposed items that show a lack of standard or modern society. Be it civil gear mixed into military outfits or a shovel grip repurposed to be a stock of a gun. Overall, the outfit has to show that the society as we know it is gone, while still having influences of a society that passed instead of a perfectly new society. That's why I would not define standard steampunk or tribal stuff as post-apo. Note that he says standard steampunk or tribal stuff. Because in those things, and I agree here, what lacks is signs of a former collapsed society, and also the whole repurposing and blah 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 stuff. So he does also emphasize standard or modern items that they kind of ruin the immersion. I believe personally that is less of a post-apocalyptic thing as such, but more of a general how surprising is it that I'm looking at. So a brand new military uniform will not surprise absolutely anyone. So this kind of ties in with my video about memorable costumes. And for Red Roach, this is important, that it doesn't ruin the artistic value or immersion by using too many modern or standard items. Alessio. Post-apocalyptic is everything that occurs after the world somehow ends. So the standard definition so far. In a lot of post-apocalyptic settings, we are not always told how it ends and why. Having this part of the setting denied usually makes sense from storytelling perspective, as it concedes with inability to retrieve infos from the past. So what he's saying, there might be some signs and all that the society has collapsed, but sometimes you don't know how and why, and that makes the story interesting. Some settings are just postmodern and can be really listed as post-apocalyptic. The common thing in the majority of post-apocalyptic setting is decay, grunge, and a sense of abandonment. Mad Max Road Warrior is not weathered at all, as quote, yeah, it was in the 80s and character design and costume design was not that popular. So what he's saying is that people shouldn't use Mad Max wasn't weathered as an excuse, because back then people, even in the movie industry, didn't do, for whatever reason, so much distressing to begin with. Weathering is a permanent component of a lot of titles we have been inspired by. Mad Max Fury Road, The Road, The Book of Eli, The Blood of Heroes, fucking Turbo Kid, Reign of Fire. By the way, Reign of Fire is a great crossover, if you will, of freaking dragons with post-apocalyptic. Absolutely works. The Earth setting in Blomkamp trilogy. And video games such as Metro, Stalker, Fallout, Borderlands, and Wasteland 2. So Alessio also counts Borderlands as post-apocalyptic, such as I do. Where there is grunge and weathering, it sure as hell there is post-apocalyptic. Technically doesn't have to be like this, but I agree that usually yes. 90 to 95% of times, yes. Is there really any post-apocalyptic setting with zero weathering? In my opinion, no. In general, I agree with that too, as in there cannot be a universe or a world or even say a city or whatever with zero weathering, but as I've said before, I think isolated places that have preserved bunkers can exist. Do not use this as an excuse to not weather your gear. Weather your gear. Even looking at it by a realistic point of view, where water and showers are still a thing, there is no way clothes and gear will be pristine after decades after a fictional end. Yep. Just think about real war zone, and Alessio knows about real war zones because he's a professional soldier, and people taking part in wars. After 6 months tour, your gear and weapons are a lot weathered. The so-called battle-worn look. So what is post-apocalyptic? Post-apo is a genre that identifies itself as dirty, dusty, and exaggerates all the consequences of survival and spending life in uncomfortable conditions. My 2 cents. So he says exaggerate all the consequences of survival and blah. This is why in my realism video I said that to tell a good story, and I say it all the time, you should exaggerate a bit, at least a bit. And not go by, oh, what would be just realistic. Because otherwise, you know, realism sometimes it's so strong and weird you wouldn't believe it's real, but a lot of times it's just too boring. Prezes of Old Town, the main Old Town organizer. What is post-apocalypse? Easy. The world has ended and that is what's left. What's my definition? I'm Old Town organizer, so I like easy post-apocalypse taken with a pinch of salt and dirt. My post-apocalypse is just brutal, colorful struggle for survival. The bombs destroyed the world, few generations pass and we still live in ruins of old world and do not try to restore it. We live from what was found, recovered, recycled, upcycled, not produced. Yeah, Fallout 1 and 2 raised me and is point of post-apocalypse. What is not post-apocalypse? Stalker. So Prezes thinks Stalker is not post-apocalypse. And seriously, in my humble opinion, there should be no clean, unused stuff in post-apoc or brand new products, whatever they are. I am not in the post-apocalypse as a result of natural disaster. There is simply nothing sexy about climate change. It's just a serious shit. Russell, the Junkyard Grizzly. What is post-apoc? That's a pretty tough question to answer without images, but for me it's a specific look that when you see it, you instantly say, okay, so the world has ended. Within the visual story of a costume, you can drop hints at how the world ended based on accessories and overall dress. For example, is that person wearing lots of clothing designed to keep them warm? Thick coat, furs, etc. Well, that's obviously a drop in temperature. Are they wearing very little clothing with Arabian-style headscarf or light clothing, for example Mad Max Thunderdome style? Well, that's likely to be global warming. You can hint at meteor strikes or dusty and polluted air with dust masks, face wraps, and lots of dust covering the clothing. Mix that with full gas masks, hoods, and some kind of visible meteor gauge, and you can tell the story of radioactive fallout. Pair these choices with equipment that have a specific task, you can enhance the story with your character's individual background. Add military gear and a gun and they look like a soldier. Or choose a headlamp, climbing gear and a backpack and they're likely a scavenger. Water bottles and a cart can denote a trader. By choosing your accessories well, you can instantly tell the story of how the world ended and how your character finds their way in it. When looking at post-apoc, you have to understand the history of materials. A prime example of this is my samurai build. I started building armor out of steel and materials that could possibly have been existent 1000 years ago. This meant I was just building a samurai armor. In order to make this tell a more post-apoc story, I had to include the German hooks and straps that we all know, thanks to Nuclear Snail, and an instant post-apoc tell. I'm also adding motocross armor panels on chainmail. This mix of modern items on a historical armor brings it back to modern post-apoc story. So crossovers work like that. That is what I also meant by crossovers or influences, which is a gray zone, like you have a samurai build and you want to combine that with post-apoc. Obviously, that works, but then you need to choose things that make it tell the post-apocalyptic part of the story, such as repurposing and also some weathering. And also some elements that signify the world that has passed. If I had chosen items and material common in the 1940s, it could look like a Fallout samurai, because Fallout is retrofuturistic Cold War era. In summary, accessories and equipment paired with correct materials and fixings tell the visual story. Elliot Montello, one of the guys behind the costumes of the series, the 100. I would say they most definitely are your very last possessions on Earth. Here refers to your clothing and gear items. Try to take as best care of them as possible. You repair them with patches, you reinforce parts that wear a lot, you most likely add things to them, but only because it enables you to carry more stuff, as everyone would be hoarders and not concerned about looking particularly cool. Look at homeless people, for example. But maybe with a little more armor for protection. What is not post-apo? Steampunk. Leave it to its own genre. And other forms of over-stylized garments that would be impractical and nonsensical. So Elliot really emphasizes the practical aspect. Again, it's your last garment. You wear it 24/7. As soon as the decoration you add, as well as your overall costume design screams, "Look, I made a costume," instead of taking you into the world's story, that is where it falls apart for me. It must look practical, and if it also look cool at the same time, then great job. Mia Shinda, I have to translate it from German real fast in my head. The post-apocalyptic stuff must be old and used, and it must be made in a way that it could have been new at some point. And of course, there should be some repairs and improvisations included, but it shouldn't be modded to death. So it must look real, not like some sort of a carnival costume. Now, what about my own definition of post-apocalyptic? I believe there are no clear borders and also no clear center in this whole post-apocalyptic definition. As I've said, for me, it is same as for a chef would be spicy food. Spice. It's just a certain color, certain palette, certain type of flavor. And yes, I agree with Russell that when you see it, you will pretty much recognize it, for the most part. And my main point in this whole thing really is better questions to ask instead is my costume a good costume? Is it within the parameters of the specific style guide of the event I'm going to? Am I using artistic devices and techniques to achieve a pleasing result? Or am I using smart-ass excuses just to gain acceptance from others? Like, oh, but I would find this in a bunker. Like, no, I mean, it's up to you. I'm not gonna chase you with a rake until your costume is good, in my opinion. But, you know, you're just robbing yourself of some good design if you find excuses instead of finding solutions. So ask yourself, is your costume telling the story you truly want to tell? And is it telling that story well? I will repeat this actually, it's important, and it rhymes. Is your costume telling the story you truly want to tell? And is it telling that story well? I will see you in the next episode. Until then, support me on Patreon, because that's how this channel functions. The link is in the video description. That's the second link. The first link is the link to the Nuclear Snail community group. You can post your works and questions and everything else there. I will see you in the next episode.